little over a week ago. On May 19th, the Associated Press published an article about Sri Lanka which began as follows. Sri Lanka marked the 8th anniversary of the end of its bloody civil war on Friday, with much of the legacy and divisions created by more than a quarter century of violence still intact. Families are still looking for their missing relatives. Others demanding their land back from military occupation. Fishermen asking for sea access blocked by the Navy. Widows heading families and handicapped persons struggling without jobs. Rehabilitated ex-rebels are shunned by a society that once glorified them. That's the AP's view of the current situation in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, I think it's accurate. But I also think the situation can be changed for the better. I'm convinced of that. I'm here on behalf of Amnesty International, a global human rights organization, to tell you that we are here to stand with you today in solidarity as you mourn and remember the dead in Sri Lanka. We have, as Kanta said, I've been working on Sri Lanka for Amnesty International since 1990. Amnesty has been publishing reports and appeals on Sri Lanka since at least 1975. I am convinced, and I know others in Amnesty are as well, that if we all work together, we actually can help to improve the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. I've been asked to divide my talk into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to I'll give a very brief history of human rights abuses in Sri Lanka at the risk of boring many of you in the audience, since I'm sure it's a very familiar story to you. I'll then describe efforts toward accountability for war crimes since the end of the war in 2009. In the second part of my talk, I will talk about human rights violations that have been going on since the end of the war, including some very disturbing incidents in the last few weeks. And then I will explain why I think we can actually help make things better in Sri Lanka. If you're not familiar with Amnesty International, we are the largest human rights organization in the world with over 7 million members and supporters. We have more than 70 Amnesty sections in countries around the world. Through our detailed research and determined campaigning, we've helped fight abuses of human rights worldwide. We bring torturers to justice, we get oppressive laws changed, and we free people jailed just for voicing their opinion. Amnesty was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977 in recognition of its work. As it happens, today is considered Amnesty International Day. Since on May 28th, back in 1961, a British lawyer named Peter Benenson published an article in the newspaper called Appeal for Amnesty 1961. That article sparked a movement that became Amnesty International. So it's very fitting that today, on May 28th, I'm with you today. And I hope you'll observe the day by signing the petitions and by taking other actions. Now, as I said, I'll give a very brief description of the history of human rights abuses in Sri Lanka to set the context. After independence from Great Britain in 1948, successive Sinhalese-dominated governments took steps to redress what they felt was unequal treatment afforded to the Tamil minority during the British colonial period. The Tamils felt marginalized and began agitating for autonomy in the north and east of the island, considered by Tamils as their traditional homeland. Decades of peaceful demonstrations led eventually to calls for an independent Tamil state in the north and east called Tamil Eelam. Tamil youth formed militant groups and began fighting the security forces. Full-scale civil war between the government forces and the opposition Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam went on from 1983 to 2009. In May of 2009, as many of you know, the government defeated the Tigers. In the final months of the war, both the government forces and the Tigers committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Crimes for which no one has been yet held accountable. During the course of the war, the security forces committed thousands of gross human rights violations against unarmed Tamils suspected of being supporters or members of the Tigers, including arbitrary detention, torture, extrajudicial executions, and enforced disappearances. In the final months of the war, the security forces deliberately attacked civilians and medical facilities trapped in the war zone and restricted the provision of food and medical supplies to the trapped civilians. The Tamil Tigers themselves were equally brutal and committed grave human rights abuses, including the indiscriminate and deliberate killing of civilians, torture of prisoners, execution of prisoners, abductions for ransom, and the forcible recruitment and use of child soldiers. In the war's final months, the Tigers used forced labor of civilians and prevented civilians attempting to leave the war zone, shooting those who tried to leave. Amnesty International has, over the past decades, campaigned publicly against and condemned the abuses committed by both government forces and the Tigers. Since the war ended in 2009, we and other human rights organizations, along with the Tamil community, have called for an international war crimes investigation in Sri Lanka as a way of establishing the truth of what happened and hopefully leading to accountability for the war criminals and justice for the victims and their families. I'll now briefly describe the efforts since the end of the war to get accountability for war crimes. In the year after the war ended in 2010, there were two developments. The Sri Lankan government set up a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission. The UN Secretary General established a panel of experts to advise him on accountability issues in Sri Lanka. The Reconciliation Commission was the Sri Lankan government's attempt to deflect international pressure on accountability for war crimes. The Commission issued a report which had some valuable recommendations, but not with regards to the war crimes issue, where the Commission uncritically accepted the evidence of the Sri Lankan military. The UN panel of experts, by contrast, issued a report that found that there were credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by both sides, which demanded an international investigation. After the UN panel issued its report in 2011, Ban Ki-moon, who was then Secretary General of the UN, said that he did not have authority on his own to set up an international investigation. He would need the consent of the Sri Lankan government or authorization by a UN body, such as the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, or the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council adopted resolutions on Sri Lanka in 2012 and in 2013, calling on the Sri Lankan government to carry out a credible investigation into war crimes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Sri Lankan government did not carry out a credible investigation at that time. It did set up a board of inquiry within the Army. The Army found that no soldiers had committed any war crimes. On March 27, 2014, the UN Human Rights Council passed a third resolution, which finally authorized the establishment of an international war crimes investigation to be carried out by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The UN High Commission staff carried out an investigation without any cooperation from the Sri Lankan government. They issued their report in September of 2015. The investigation found serious violations of international humanitarian law, such as, by government forces, attacks on civilians, restrictions on humanitarian assistance, torture, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, and other crimes. The investigation also found, on the part of the Tamil Tigers, crimes including forced recruitment of adults and children, and coercive measures to stop civilians leaving the conflict area. Shortly after the UN High Commissioner's report was published, the Human Rights Council passed a resolution, Resolution 30-1, on October 1st of 2015. That resolution was actually co-sponsored by the Sri Lankan government. In the resolution, the Sri Lankan government promised to pursue accountability for war crimes and other past human rights abuses by establishing a judicial mechanism with a special counsel and with international participation, as well as a Truth Commission, an Office on Reparations, and an Office for Missing Persons. Since then, since October of 2015, legislation establishing the Office of Missing Persons has been passed by the Parliament, but that office has not yet been set up. And the government has not taken any other steps to establish the other mechanisms. As required by the resolution, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was tasked with providing follow-up reports to the Human Rights Council at its June 2016 session and the Council's March 2017 session. Both reports by the UN High Commissioner documented the lack of progress by the Sri Lankan government in meeting its commitments under Resolution 30/1. The Human Rights Council passed another resolution this past March, giving the Sri Lankan government, in effect, 2 more years to carry out their commitments under Resolution 30/1. While the government's commitments under the resolution are a welcome change from the prior government's attitude toward human rights and toward the international community, we need to be very cautious in assessing the current situation. Sri Lanka has a long history of creating domestic mechanisms to look into high-profile cases of human rights violations, but then the investigations end up going nowhere and no one is ultimately held accountable. Actually, in 2009, Amnesty International issued a report which was entitled 20 Years of Make-Believe, Sri Lanka's Commissions of Inquiry. That report details how one commission after another was set up over the years by the Sri Lankan government, mostly to deflect international pressure on human rights violations by government forces without providing any accountability. Given that, and given the recent cases, which I'll mention later, and which we briefly mentioned earlier, and are represented by the petitions at the back, we need to keep campaigning to ensure that the Sri Lankan government finally ends years of impunity and provides accountability. I'm going to stop at this point. Thank you.